Shalom and welcome. I'm Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, chairman of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, an organization of rabbis from all movements who are committed to promoting Jewish unity and promoting good, positive, constructive relations with Israel. And so in that context, I'm very pleased to bring Gil Troy, who is a good friend of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, today to our webinar, and we'll be speaking with him. The title of our talk today is The Agony and the Ecstasy, referring, of course, to both the mixed blessings about the accord that was recently reached with the Hamas negotiators to release hostages and also to release prisoners. Of course, as we all know, there are those in the media who are somehow describing it in a really blasphemous way, as if it's just an even exchange. Prisoners for prisoners or hostages for hostages. And so nevertheless, we're going to learn a little bit more about that from Gil Troy. Just to give you by way of background, those of you who don't know, Gil is a very prolific writer. His most recent book is called To Resist the Academic Intifada, Letters to My Students and Defending the Zionist Dream. It's a very important new book that is available. Gil has a website called it's giltroy.com, which has just all the books that he's written is really quite amazing. He's also a scholar of the American presidency, and so he's written about Clinton and Reagan. So in addition to having an eye on Israel, he also has a keen eye on what happens here in North America. He is and I say North America because he's a professor at the distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University. But in addition to this important new book, the Resisting the Academic Intifada, Gil has also written a three-volume set about Theodor Herzl Zionist writings, which is the first publication of the Library of the Jewish People. In addition to that, the book that many of us are familiar with, Arthur Hertzberg's book, The Zionist Idea, which came out, I think, when was it? In the 70s or so. Gil recently revised and called it, instead of The Zionist Idea, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, and Tomorrow, which is a very important book. All of his books are important, including the one that I think is really essential for anyone who has any interest in the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel and America and Israel. That's the book that he co-authored with Natan Sharansky called Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People, which refers to the three different phases of Natan Sharansky's career. So I could go on, but trust me, he is certainly very well qualified to speak with us today. So Gil, thank you so much. He's speaking to us from Tel Aviv, by the way, and where the weather is a lot better than it is here in outside of Washington, D.C. So let's get right into it. Gil, this agreement, and we hear so many things about it. That's why we called it this program, the Agony and the Ecstasy. So give us some of your initial personal reflections, and then also what are you hearing from your compatriots in Israel about how they feel about what's coming, both what just happened and what's going to be happening.
So first of all, Erev Tov, Tzoraim Tovim, and after that very kind introduction by Stuart, you're bound to be disappointed, but that's his fault, not mine. I am indeed a huge supporter of your initiative. It breaks my heart that it's necessary, and I always joke that when I grew up, you simply were a rabbi. You didn't need to put Zionist as the modifier because that's what being a rabbi and a communal leader was all about. Because it was so central, and it's dismaying to see the work we have to do, the repertory work we have to do. I also see many I don't say old friends anymore, but friends of long standing on the call. So I want to say hello to you, and I just want to thank you. I don't know if you guys if you people appreciate just how much the support of the American Jewish community, the Canadian Jewish community, the world community has meant for us in Israel since October 7th. It's not surprising that someone like me, who's back and forth and has so many personal relationships, can see it. But it's really been interesting for me to see my real Israeli friends who, for the first time, are recognizing just how important it is to have voices throughout North America standing up for us, and how fragile things were, not just in the horrific days after October 7th, but month after month. And so really, kol hakavod, it's much appreciated. And I also know the many tensions that you people have been navigating. I will get to the point of the call in a second. My new obsession now is, people talk about October 8th, October 7th or 8th Jews. I call it, Zionism, October 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. My new obsession is what I call April 1st Zionists. What's an April 1st Zionist? I have a very close friend who wrote a $2,000 check for my kids when they were up north and didn't have proper equipment. That's how in he is. That's how much he loves my friend, my kids. That's how much he loves Israel, and is a Zionist. But as an April 1st Zionist, April 1st is when the World Central Kitchen disaster happened. And he and so many people said, why did you kill those people? And why is this taking so long? And the failure, by the way, on the part of outgoing Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to explain fog of war, to explain the difficulties of urban warfare. And I say him because not only he was Secretary of Defense, but he led the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, is something that scares me as an American. But I call this new phenomenon April 1st Zionists because it's people who are who love us, who support us, who just feel it's gone on too long. And those April 1st Zionists, now we get to that, were sending me email after email. What a great day. This is so exciting when those three holy women were released. Now, of course, every one of us in Israel, it's so funny, everybody calls them by their first names. We've never met them, right? And that shows the power of us, the power of our community, how meaningful it is one life after another. But what my April 1st Zionist friends missed was, as we're hearing those stories, we're hearing about the release or the imminent release of the Hebrew University murderer, of the murderer of Richard Lakin, a peace activist who was bludgeoned to death on a Jerusalem bus, the murderer of Hillel Fauld's brother. We're hearing one story after another of the murderers who have been released. And so, no, I can find room in my heart for joy for the individuals. But first of all, this drip, drip, drip of human beings is devastating. What it means is that we are now, for the next 6 weeks, addicted to reliving the trauma of October 7th, day after day after day. And then at the end, we're only going to have 33 freed or known. The lack of clarity about who's alive, who's dead. It's kind of like, I want you to come to my house. I'm going to offer you that you can buy my house for $10 million. I'm not going to tell you how much my house is worth. I'm not going to tell you how much of my house I'm going to give you. I'm not going to tell you when I'm going to do it. And so, on the one hand, it's very easy to give a beautiful sermon about how much we love life and how important this is. But to really sit with the problematics of it and to sit with the pain. And so I'm going to put on the table, and I know that I'm speaking to people who are of a higher spiritual and moral quality than I am, but my new conclusion, or one of my takeaways from this painful moment, is Israel needs to be far more aggressive in implementing a death penalty. And the way I would structure it, and I would wish that it wouldn't just be Israel, but it would be the entire Western world, would say from now on, if you commit a terrorist act that intentionally kills 3 or more people or children, then there are going to be special tribunals, and within 6 months, you're going to get the death penalty once you've been convicted. And I know that's a very problematic issue in the United States, but I notice even that Joe Biden's clemency was for 37, not 40, and the 3 who were left behind were either perpetrators of outrageous terrorist attacks or racist attacks. And so even in his opposition to the death penalty, there was room to acknowledge it. And the problem is, the reason why I'm raising this issue, because I think I wanted to make this kind of interesting, and I want us to struggle, because we're struggling, is because as painful as the deal is, it would be that much less painful if these most heinous criminals weren't being let out. And whether they've been in jail for 20 years or a year and a half, when you've crossed the line and committed such outrageous acts, you shouldn't be in play as a potential free person. And so I just share with you the ambiguousness I
So
share.
Gil, I'm sure, yeah, that's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, of course, we have the conflicting values of Pidyon Shoim, releasing hostages, redeeming hostages, and on the other hand, the long-term security of Israel, and also the aspect of letting these murderers free. I want to ask you, when there was that scene of the three young women being transported, and it was, the TV pictures we saw was just that, so you don't really know how many people really were there, but you saw all these Hamas fighters who apparently came out of the tunnels where they had been almost, out of underground in certain respects, standing on top of and really terrifying, standing on top of the vehicles and so on and so forth. How did you feel? How did people feel seeing that particular image there?
Let's go in three directions. First of all, in previous releases, some of the hostages said that their most terrifying moments during the entire traumatic, at the time it was 51 or 53 or 55 days of activity, was that moment of release. And let's go even deeper. And the sickness that these three women were given release certificates and goodie bags. I mean, the sick psychological game that's being played needs to be called out morally. And I think we in Israel very much felt that. I think also we were struck by the fact that, again, if we go to my April 1st Zionists, and I think it's important to talk about, because I hate the demonization. Oh, because they deviated from the Bibi line, they're anti-Zionist. No, they're in the tent. But the degree to which they also live in a world where there are 3,000 terrorists from October 7th, there are, 25,000 Hamasnikim, and everybody else is innocent. And everybody else is starving, and everybody else is suffering. Those pictures suggest that maybe the mass starvation is a lie. That and again, I don't want to minimize the degree to which there have been innocents killed and the pain. And again, as a father of miluimikim, of reservists, they've been a part of it. And the moral. I always say, at the end of the day, the most important moral questions that we have to deal with are: what are my kids feeling when they look in the mirror? What are our soldiers thinking about? What are the moral challenges they're dealing with? I'm less concerned with the propaganda points. So I don't want to minimize anything, but it to us it felt like a farce. And someone like Melanie Phillips wrote a scorching article about the difference between the dynamic on the streets of Gaza and the narrative that's being told.
Yes, we're going to be sending that out, as a matter of fact, with our Thursday mailing to our colleagues. But Gil, the IDF has been done an unbelievable job in terms of its work with, fighting in territory which was brand new to them, fighting against Hamas and against Hezbollah, what happened in Syria attributed to them, and so on and so forth. And yet, Hamas still seems to be standing. What do you make of where Hamas is, and their ability to continue to fight another day? What will it take to really get them? Is defeat or surrender a possibility?
Look, from the start, I was a little more cautious than our leaders. I recall how hard it was for the United States of America, with all its power, to track down Osama bin Laden. And I also know that it's very hard to defeat an idea. So me, and I'm not important, but my articulation of war aims has always been about degrading Hamas and limiting Hamas's power. That's number one. Number two, the most important thing is the safety of my cousin, Adele Raymer, who was in a safe house for 11 hours on Kibbutz Nirim, and everybody who lives in the Otef, everybody who lives in the Gaza corridor. And I think we have to acknowledge that, as frustrating as it is to see these displays of power by Hamas, every Israeli, and even the Israelis who lived along the Gaza corridor, are much safer today than they were October 6th and October 7th. So there really has been a game changer.
Have they started to move back, by the way, into those areas?
Yeah, they're transitioning. The Kibbutz Nirim, which I've visited 3 or 4 times over the last couple of months, they've cleaned it up. They're starting a process. They're talking about a timetable. And one of the things, by the way, that nobody's talking about in the deal, which to me is a huge success, is it was just sort of, as we say in Hebrew, muvan me'elav, it was just sort of accepted that there'd be a buffer zone. And at the last minute, there was some quibbling about the size of the buffer zone, but I think at its smallest point, it's 780 meters, which is about a kilometer. Not since 1967 has Israel taken territory from the Palestinians. And of course, 67 was the Jordanians and Egyptians. I'm well aware, but I'm phrasing it in that way and framing it in that way, not in a sloppy way, but on purpose. Because unfortunately, many Palestinians, I'm very careful to say not all Palestinians, but many Palestinians, and at the heart of Palestinian political culture is a love of land over human beings. And one of the things that was clear to me from day one, and has just sort of been worked into the assumption of war aims, is that in order for my cousin and everybody else to return, there has to be a demilitarized zone on their side. And that demilitarized zone has to be where there's no farming, no 12-year-old skipping and throwing flowers and pushing the line as they did before October 7th. And they lost territory. And I know Hamas is busy boasting.
Proclaiming
But
victory. Right.
let's focus on three things. One, they lost territory because they attacked. And that is, by the way, the traditional language of war. If you attack and you lose territory. And so I think that's very, very important. And I think they know it, even if they're not saying it. Number two is there's this spin, is that this deal is the exact same deal as the May deal. I think there are two fundamental differences. And Haviv Reded Gur wrote an excellent piece about this. And he pointed out that, first of all, the timetable, as excruciating as the timetable is that we're stuck with now, was even longer then. And two, we are allowed to be in the Philadelphia corridor. And those are two huge concessions. But the most important thing, what did we learn from our lovely academic presidents? It's all about context. The context of this deal is very different than the context in May. And Stuart, you touched on this a little bit, because Iran is weakened. Hezbollah, which we were terrified of, has been crushed, and Syria collapsed. And so those three things mean that even if Hamas survives another day, it is in a very different position. And that is because, and I've criticized Bibi Netanyahu on many things over his lack of leadership, his lack of unity, but on this, he stood up to Biden, he stood up to Blinken, he stood up to the Americans. And as a result, the pressure, which again drove my April 1st Zionists crazy, the pressure created that pressure cooker so that we could do what we needed to do, partially in Iran, more fully in Lebanon, and then have that impact in Syria.
No, I'm reminded of the story of the man who was afraid of a dog, and the owner says, "Well, don't worry, his bark is bigger than the bite." And the guy says, "I know that, you know that, but does the dog know that?" My question is, the people in Gaza know what you've just said, that Hamas has been defeated. What's it going to take for them to say, because every so often, I'm sure many of us in this call have seen those clips of the person who is very upset with Hamas for having destroyed, Gaza and so on and so forth. What we don't see is what happens to the guy after that statement is made. But what will it take for Palestinians to realize that, do you think, Gazans in particular?
So, I don't think that they are as stupid and as fanatic as the media plays them to be. I think most Gazans are well aware of the destruction that was wrought on their homes. And while many people like to blame us, I think many of them do blame Hamas. And I think Hamas has been degraded. Also, I mean, everybody's talking about, Hamas has now been rearmed. Well, first of all, many of the arms they're using now are just their reconditioning ordnance that Sahel dropped. And the amount of firepower that they had amassed by October 7th was huge and massive, and that has been severely eliminated. And their so-called fighters who are returning are undertrained, often underage fighters. So the most important thing is militarily making sure that Hamas is never as strong as it was. The political issue is much more complicated. And again, here I gave Netanyahu a compliment. I don't think he has led. I don't care about you. I don't care about me. I care about my kids. He's not led the Miluimnikim. He's not led the Chayalim. He's not led the reservists and soldiers on the kind of Churchillian journey that they deserved to be on, to understand what the day after will look like, to understand that they have the true moral and political clarity about why they're fighting. And what has been interesting in the last week is that both Antony Blinken in his farewell speech to the Atlantic Council, and Dennis Ross in an article that he wrote in the Washington Post, both started talking about a day after plan, which brings in the Saudis, which brings in the different Arab countries. We heard in, I think, 3 confirmation hearings by various incoming, or hopefully from their perspective, incoming Trump appointees, that they have very little bandwidth for Hamas to return. So Hamas may be having a temporary victory, but I think there may be forces at play that are ultimately going to dislodge Hamas politically. One thing that's often overlooked, which I think is much more significant, is people talk about the Saudis, people talk about the UAE, people talk about the reformed Palestinian Authority, and that has to go deeper than just being a slogan. Reformed Palestinian Authority and 2 states for 2 peoples are 2 of the most wearying, useless cliches that help us go nowhere, especially since October 7th. But I think we also have to add in the clans. I think we always underestimate the degree to which both the territories, West Bank, Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call them, and Gaza are still very clan-based, because we Westerners impose our nationalist conceptions on it. And I think we have to start thinking, our leaders have to start looking at what clans, and I'm under no illusions that they love Israel, or that they love the Jews, but the clans hate Hamas, and how to bring them back in and how to use their power is what's necessary in a very complicated chess game that I don't have confidence that the government is playing well.
So many points here. Just briefly, you alluded to the fact, it's one of the things we hear, this deal could have happened 6 months ago, but it doesn't take into account the fact that Sinwar is not anymore. And so are people still saying that, or is that kind of going by the wayside now?
It's definitely one of the cliches, but I certainly believe, and I argued today in my column in the Jerusalem Post, that this deal, even if it was the same deal, and again, I don't even believe that it is in a very different context. It's a context of and the most important thing is that we've restored deterrence. What we lost on October 7th was deterrence. And in many ways, we'd even lost it way before that, because, you know, I know many of you have been back and forth to Israel. Until September 17th, the fear on the streets of Tel Aviv in particular, much more so than Jerusalem, but the fear on the streets of Israel vis-a-vis Hezbollah, about towers being knocked down, about 2-3 weeks without electricity, about not having water. I myself, downstairs in my basement, had big tubs of water and bought a generator. Because my neighbor bought a generator, says, okay, I don't want to be that guy who feels stupid for not buying the generator. We in Jerusalem were much less worried, but there was a general fear that Hezbollah were better trained, better armed, and were going to knock us. And the degree to which we degraded them, and the degree to which that then further degraded Iran and Syria, is, to me, historic and much more significant than the game that Hamas is playing. Because Hamas was never scared us. And by the way, that was the big mistake, right? October 6th thinking was not being as afraid of Hamas as we were afraid of Hezbollah. Part of the reason why we had the beepers and all that stuff is because we took them really seriously. Never, ever, ever underestimate your enemy. Never, ever, ever underestimate your rabbinic rivals either. When you do that, that's when you lose. That's when you get dislodged. And that was a mistake.
So in regard to Hezbollah and in the north, people have not yet started to return to their homes yet, have they?
No, there's a very small trickle. I think people are kind of coming in assessing damage, but there hasn't been the big movement. We still have some time on the formal ceasefire. There still is apparently a lot of activity day to day, and it's not surprising. I mean, I spoke to one miluimnik, one reservist, who told me before it was reported. He said, "You have no idea. We went into these bunkers," and he said every house along the border is a bunker. Vast quantities of unopened boxes. Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. Some of it has been brought back for intelligence. And by the way, I'm reminded of the degree to which the Pentagon was not a big fan of Israel until 1973. And in 1973, all of a sudden, Israel started sending, after the resupply, which everybody talks about, there was a counter supply where Israel started sending back all kinds of Russian ordnance, all kinds of planes, all kinds of Russian material that they had seized in the Sinai in the 73 war. And since then, the Pentagon has been much more pro-Israel and much more aware of the intelligence and defense upside to the Israel-American alliance. And I think the Pentagon has had some massive intelligence gifts and gift bags that it got from Hezbollah.
So
Or via Hezbollah, we should say.
when in that Atlanta Council speech that you referred to, if I'm not mistaken, is when Secretary of State Blinken had indicated that Hamas might have come to an agreement sooner were it not for their sense that they had support around the world and with the demonstrations in their favor and so on. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think though there are three very important documents if we really want to understand what's going on. There's Joe Biden's farewell address to the State Department. I'm not talking about his formal farewell address to the American people. There's Anthony Blinken's on first name basis, farewell interview to the New York Times and the Atlantic Council. And let's focus on three things. First of all, read the New York Times interview without looking at Blinken's answers. Just look at the questions with which he is bombarded. And if we want to go to my April 1st Zionists, you will see the headspace and you're living it. But it's a kind of a beautiful articulation, beautiful in quotation marks, of the kind of pressure that most Jews and most American leaders are on because the woman just pushes genocide and ethnic cleansing and Boogie Yalon and boom, boom, boom. And that's what's going on in many circles, especially in blue state America, where most American Jews live. That's number one. Number two, I'm dismayed that both President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken were so quick to take credit for a weakened Iran, a destroyed Hezbollah, a collapsed Syria, without noticing that part of the reason why that happened was because Bibi Netanyahu defied them. And in his farewell speech at the State Department, Biden does add one sentence about saying, well, it wasn't just me, it was Israel too. But and I don't need this for I'm wearing my American history hat. Political mistakes are excusable. Not learning from your mistakes is inexcusable. And I think there has to be a bit of an accounting by Biden and Blinken and their supporters of the degree to which they were putting Israel under tremendous pressure. Israel defied it, and then they gave Blinken and Biden things they could boast about. And then finally, to go to your question, which is very important, in his New York Times interview, Blinken says something to me which is even more important. He said, "Where was the world?" That's an exact quote. Tony Blinken says, "Where was the world?" He said, if they had put more pressure on Hamas with the hostages, there would have been a very different outcome. And here I'll get a little political because I'm just speaking for myself. And I think when we also look back and we want to learn lessons, we will see that this hostage movement in Tel Aviv has been more of a problem in terms of getting hostages out than anything else. I said from the start that, and I learned this from Chaim Avraham, whose son Benny Avraham was kidnapped in September 2000, one of the three, and he had his criticisms of the government. He never uttered a criticism of the government. All he did was go from capital to capital outside and put pressure. There wasn't enough of a worldwide campaign on Qatar, on Turkey, and frankly on the Americans and the West to make it a Western issue. And the internal pressure, and somehow the notion that it was Bibi Netanyahu more than Hamas, and by the way, that's also both Blinken and Biden, especially Blinken, says that Blinken uses the phrase in the Atlantic Council speech, Hamas were the spoilers. And the whole narrative has been off. But the narrative has partially been off by some of the dynamics that have been going on right here in Israeli politics.
You're touching on a very sensitive issue there, because there are those who say that part of what that is really an anti-government, anti-Bibi movement. I will tell you this, then, that is that I have also felt that it's the wrong address to be pressing the Israeli government. When I've spoken with hostage families in a delicate kind of way, I indicated that and had shared, and some of you may feel the same way as well, that rather than bring them home, the saying should have been let them go. Referring to Hamas, putting the onus on them where it belongs.
It put the price up. It raised the price because they saw the degree to which they're driving us crazy and the degree to which their psychological torture is working. So just from game theory, it was actually a mistake. And my whole political philosophy, which is important, I think, to articulate as we mark the new presidency, comes from my Rebbe, Ed Koch, who said, "If you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist." And so, yes, I can give Bibi credit for defying Blinken and Biden. I can criticize Bibi for not speaking to my kids and our holy soldiers. And I can also say that I'm someone who called for Bibi Netanyahu's resignation in 2017 because I'd learned from the Clinton administration that at a certain point when you're under trial and you're desperate to avoid jail, you turn on the institutions that you're supposed to protect and you're supposed to represent. And in the same breath, I can say that indeed the black and red colors of the hostage movement come from the Prime Minister movement of 2020. What, there are no other colors in the rainbow? And so all these things have gotten complicated, and we have to kind of try to unpack many of these overlapping threads.
So is there any hope for, I mean, on the one hand, there is the sense of unity, and on the other hand, there's the sense of the divisiveness, divisions. There are those who say that Bibi delayed has been prolonging the war in order to, delay his trial and having to leave office, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any opinions about that, Gil, that would be of interest to us?
Again, I don't have any inside information, so it's more like, the tea leaves. But I know that, let's go back to October 7th, 2024, the first anniversary. One of the things that was stunning about being here in Israel was everybody had the same feeling, which was, wow, no matter how despairing we were on October 8th, 9th, 10th, 2023, none of us thought we'd still be in it a year later. None of us thought there'd still be hostages a year later. We all were on the 6-day war timetable or the Yom Kippur 3-week timetable. We thought this would be about 2, 3, 4 months. Bibi Netanyahu would have been president for life if he had been able to dislodge Hamas, prime minister for life, I should say, crush Hezbollah, weaken Iran, see Syria collapse had he done it in 2 or 3 months. I don't believe he's been trying to prolong the war. I do believe that it's a much more complicated, much more entrenched situation than we believed, and we've seen it that the Miluimnikim, the reservists I keep speaking to, still say there's work to be done, still say there's a purpose for fighting. And the way I kind of navigate this whole question of divisiveness is I talk about politics and I talk about society. We have seen since October 7th, 2023, Israeli society at its most magnificent. I really say I switch off my historian brain and I go much more closer to your brain, a kind of a mystical sense of and it's almost been exhilarating to be here with all the loss, with all the pain, with all the trauma, with all the fear, because to see the heroism on the streets, the voluntarism, the altruism, the love of country, the unity, even without uniformity in Israeli society, shows, the old cliche, every the people get the government that they deserve. No, no, no. In this case, we have a government we don't deserve, and the people, the society, is so much better than its politicians. And when I say that, I include Lapid and Yair Golan and Gantz, as well as Bibi and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Oh my.
Talking about the interviews by Biden and Blinken, there was also a very important statement, I think, yesterday from President Herzog in the Davos conference, where he said he has been a fan of a supporter of the concept of a two-state solution, but after October 7th, it was a wake-up call for him. I think those were almost the exact words that he used. It seemed to me as if he's reflecting basic current popular opinion within Israel. I know personally when I've heard somebody like Blinken or others say in the same breath we have to defeat Hamas. And by the way, the reason, and other commentators on CNN and elsewhere, and we need to make sure that there's a Palestinian state because that will, satisfy the pent-up frustrations and things like that. Is it correct that he's not just, I mean, obviously his opinion is very important, but is he also reflecting something within that we rabbis in America should be aware of that's happening in Israeli society?
It was terrifying to me, again, with my American history hat on, to see the degree to which American policymakers went to two-state solution 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks after October 7th. If there's one thing October 7th showed us, is that there's a central force in the Palestinian national movement, not just in Hamas, but I read Hamas's charter. I've read the rhetoric of Abbas that is eliminationist. From the river to the sea. Look at my world, the academic world. Look at what's happening on campus. They don't say that that's a no Jewish state solution. And to hear American policymakers go back to the same tired thing and not acknowledge, not work into their timetable and into their timeline, the failure from from the Oslo agreements and the failure from the Gaza disengagement, and not to read what George W. Bush promised Ariel Sharon, which I have. I'll send you in that essential guide I put together. He says, you'll be free to defend yourself because we're going to have peace. And then it goes broader. Everybody talks about Bibi and the Concepcia, and I have my criticisms. But there was an American Concepcia that said that Hamas was pragmatic. There was an American Concepcia that said, let's deal with it. And they were so busy blaming Bibi, they haven't learned. If they're not learning, they're not going forward. So I met with the Canadian ambassador, and I said to her, really? Like, where's your intellectual seriousness and just going back? And she said, well, that's the phrase you people keep on using. So I said, you know what? Okay, I'll accept that. And now, partially after conversation with my friend, the great human rights activist, Erwin Kotler, I came up with a phrase that he said he'd been using for years. I don't call for two states for two peoples anymore. I call for two democracies for two peoples. As soon as we do that, what happens? First of all, I'm not negating Palestinian aspirations, and I'm respecting them as human beings and respecting them as a potential polity, because I know how important nationalism is to me, both as an American and a Zionist. And that's not a fake political posture. That's a genuine moral stand. But as soon as I say two democracies rather than two peoples, I change the dynamics. As soon as we say two states for two peoples, the question is, how much is Israel going to carve from the territories it stole from them in order to make them happy? And the failure of Oslo and the failure of Gaza, the disengagement show never enough. When we say two democracies for two peoples, and this is also comes from my work with Sharansky, we're saying not just what is Israel going to do, but what are you going to do? How are you going to build civil society? How are the Norwegians and the Canadians and all the lovely people in the world?
I understand and accept that, Gil. But by the way, I was just listening to some Palestinian journalist yesterday on NPR, who had some comments. So, why is it Israelis get to determine what kind of government we're going to have and so on and so forth? But if you're talking about two democracies, the democracy, they might choose Hamas. What do you say then?
If they have, well, we learned George W. Bush allowed elections without civil society.
Right.
You cannot, if you create the civil society I'm talking about, if you really have the nation building and by the way, they've learned, but this is a very politically incorrect thing to say, but the Israeli jails have been an essential laboratory for Palestinian democracy, is because Palestinians in jail have learned about rule of law, have learned about Bagatz, the courts, have learned about and sometimes exploited Israeli democracy. And I have more respect for Palestinians. And I think that had we spent the 30, 40 years since Oslo building civil society, we wouldn't get to Israeli or American or British precepts, but we wouldn't be in Hamas land. And I have no problem if they're not ready, they're not ready. But at the end of the day, by talking about it, it's both a political move and a moral move. It allows me to carve out room to respect Palestinian national aspirations, but it also says, what are you doing? What changes are you making? And it frees me from just being Mr. No. And it also frees me from the other American idiocy of the Reformed Palestinian Authority. By just adding those two words, I mean, when you talk about the modifier of Zionist Rabbinical Coalition, and I see how you live that Zionism, that's a real modifier. But every time they simply ape the words the Reformed without really implementing any reforms, I'm not convinced. And it scares me again because I just see the same nonsense.
So I want to ask about the PA and what's happening in Judea and Samaria in a second. But one of the questions that one of the rabbis had submitted was there had been a float of a possible whether it's been temporary displacement or whatever of Palestinians to Indonesia. Have you heard about that?
I heard about it in the context of some people from Trump land. Go back to the Palestinian person you're quoting. I don't want to get into transfer, into displacement. I think it's an interesting question to say, how come Egypt, that wonderful, beautiful democracy, had no room in its heart to open up even temporary camps in the Sinai
Huh.
when evil Israelis were bombing Gaza? But of
Which,
course, it's
according to
always
international law, they were obligated to do, and nobody talks
yeah,
about that.
exactly. No one talks about that. No one talks about the smuggling that came from Egypt. How did all those weapons get there? Right? How are all the weapons coming now to the territories from Jordan? So there are many things to talk about. I don't want that kind of Israeli conversation. In the same way that I don't want the Israeli. Notice there's a subtlety here. I am proud. I have no problem saying that that we took territory for a buffer zone. But I don't want to then go to settlements in Gaza because Sharon, for all the mistakes of the disengagement, was right militarily. What people don't talk about is the degree to which having 21 centers that had to be circled and had to be defended all the time, and the convoys going back and forth, was for him a military drain on on Tzahal, and also was an emotional drain because various people were killed in the transit. And so I don't want to go back to that, but I do think we have to start learning how to take territory every time there's an incursion, every time there's bombing. I think that security zone has to be expanded the more aggression that comes from the other side, because that's the traditional language of war. You attack, you lose land.
So let me ask you this: in regard to Judea and Samaria, what's going on there? And it's what is it called now? Operation Iron Wall or something like that. And the PA had been doing some stuff, and now uh, they're
Tzahal.
Tzahal. They've deferred to Tzahal. Just give us a little bit of insight in terms of what we're seeing and what to expect of what's going on there, why, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so let's take one step back and again go to my April 1st Zionists who uh, look at me and literally their moral categories are terrorists and everybody else who's innocent Palestinians. And if we look at the 72% of the West Bank in polls who supported October 7th, if we look at my own son's testimony that he was in Dudavan in the commando unit, was finished in August, came back after October. He said in the first 2.5 weeks after October 7th, he saw more swastikas in graffiti and more Nazi-oriented stuff than he'd seen in the 2.5 years of patrolling the territories before that.
Hmm.
And he also told me that during the first 8 months, Sahal was working very, very diligently, trying to keep it under wraps with all the emphasis on Gaza. And he said, you have no idea the amount of munitions we found. You have no idea the tunnels. We're not just talking about a terror tunnel problem in Gaza. There are terror tunnels in the West Bank. In Judea and Samaria, there are terror tunnels in mosques, and in the same way that I talk about Hamasks and hospitals, and hospitals and killer gardens in Gaza, they're there in Judea and Samaria too. And so, partially with the world focusing on Gaza, Sahel, since October 7th, has been trying to limit and degrade the military infrastructure that's built up over there because the threat assessment has changed. Now, one of the big differences, and this in some ways contradicts what I was saying about settlements, because nobody really knows. One of the reasons why there's less concern about an October 7th type scenario in the territories is because the settlers there are armed. And the people along the Atef, the people along the Gaza corridor, had been, for various reasons, because they feared Bedouin marauders more than they feared Hamas, had put their armaments in the armories. And that's why, to me, one of the saddest places in Israel, or perhaps in the world, is the big, beautiful green lawn in front of the armory in Kfar Aza, where, because they had done their intelligence well, the Hamasnikim went straight there after the incursion, and they ambushed the holy warriors who were part of the security team there because they didn't have they didn't have arms.
Right. That was
So
where we saw you when the ZRC had its mission and you
yes,
were there at the same time.
same
Uh,
time, all right, for us, and that was there were places which were more brutal, but that was the place that in some ways broke my heart. Um, and the so right now, I think Israel, partially because of the dynamics with Trump, and Trump also has, you may not have noticed, but a very short and a short attention span and a mercurial personality. And so I think Israel is kind of taking advantage of the fact that he's focused on Gaza, and he wanted the Gaza ceasefire as his inaugural gift. So that allows a little bit more room for maneuvering in the territories. But the problem with the territories is the buildup has been intense. And also, let's talk about it. I, you know, I am furious that my son also has sometimes had rocks thrown at him by fellow Jews. And thank God he and his buddies weren't injured. But can you imagine, as a parent or as a soldier, being attacked by a fellow Jew? Nevertheless, the problem of settler violence has been exaggerated. The problem of Palestinian terrorism has been minimized. By the way, the INSS, the Institute for National Security Services, for Security Studies, has an excellent website calling the war through numbers. And on their website, they say something like there have been 8,263, I think, terrorist attempts. By the way, the other number they have, which is really important, is I think the number is now 37,267 times that Israelis have had to run for shelter since October 7th. That's not 37,000 Israelis, but 37,000 different times in 935 different cities and towns. And these are the things that my April 1st Jews forget. The degree to which this is an ongoing challenge. I just checked into this hotel in Tel Aviv, and they had all the instructions about where to go. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm not in Jerusalem, I'm in Tel Aviv. The chances of me hearing a siren tonight are much greater. Now, I don't really get unnerved by these things, but be 12, be 5, be 7, be a more nervous personality. Those are acts of war. And those are sort of just now, well, in the same way that, as you said at the very beginning, that we compare mass murderers with women and children and elders and human beings who were stolen from their beds or stolen from concerts, and we compare them. So too, yeah, well, Israel had another siren. That's normal. It's not normal. It's not acceptable. And we have to have zero tolerance for this. We need to change the moral conversation about what's happening here.
well, what's the psyche and the impact of those kinds of things? The 37,000 times of having to run to a shelter and things like that, would you say?
So it's funny, there was a much more elaborate and developed conversation about the impact that it had on the kids of Sderot. And in many ways, like, look, on one level, everybody's not we can't call ourselves PTSD because the P, I'm looking forward to the day when it's PTSD, when it's post-trauma, right?
Yeah.
Everybody to one degree or another is struggling with trauma, and everybody does their own thing. So I'll tell you my personal story. What was our first experience in Jerusalem of the ceasefire? At, what was it, 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the middle of Tefillot on Shabbat morning, our first Azakah in Jerusalem in a couple of weeks. And we have an outdoor minyan, which started in COVID, has continued. And we had about 35, 40 people who went inside. It's in somebody's chatzer, in somebody's yard, and he has it downstairs. And 30, if there were 35 people, 31 went downstairs, and 4 of us stayed outside. And each one had a slightly different psychological reason. Part of also was we wanted we stayed with the Sefer Torah. Now, of course, we could have carried the Sefer Torah in, right? I'm well aware of that. But we said, no, we're staying outside with the Sefer Torah. And part of it is I have a thing of I'm post October 7th, they're not going to humiliate me. They're not knocking me down. I'm not crazy, but I didn't really feel like I was truly under threat. But I'm not going. And each one of us who were outside were saying, we're not letting this happen. So what's going on is everybody's to each his own or her own coping mechanisms. But what's missing is an acknowledgement of how unacceptable that is. This is not okay. And even as I talk about the exhilaration and the joy and the love and the outpouring of positive, what upsets me is the degree to which the negative is just sort of seen as, well, what do you expect? You live in Israel. Magia lacha. Well, no, we don't deserve this kind of behavior. We don't deserve these kind of neighbors. We don't deserve this kind of treatment.
And I can just imagine, though, in terms of the feeling of the entire world being against you as Israelis,
Yeah.
and now even with that situation with the Israelis reservists who were in Brazil and they had to leave all of a sudden, and because they would could be arrested perhaps and so on, and so they're coming after us anywhere and everywhere. It's really making the feeling that they were truly surrounded, not just on Israel's borders, but beyond that as well.
My kids are very conscious of where they will travel and where they won't travel. It's an ongoing conversation among the 20, 30-year-old set.
Really? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I can imagine.
And it's relatively new, right? It's 3, 4 weeks. And where are we in calling out the ICC? Where are we in calling out the farce that they've made of international law? And by the way, as Americans, you should be terrified. If there is a international warrant for the arrest of Bibi Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, there is no reason why there can't be an international warrant for the arrest of Barack Obama and George W. Bush and anybody who was in charge of, and Lloyd Austin, and anybody who was in charge of America during, or the American Army during Iraq and Afghanistan, because our war crimes, in quotation marks, don't match the scale of America's. Now, of course, we're little and America's big, but I think that's one of the issues, and the degree to which the international farcical courts ignored the principle of complementarity, which says that when you have a democratic system, which does have a code of ethics and does have military discipline and does have a chain of command and does have investigations and does have people being punished, the degree to which they just decided that that was irrelevant, and then another moral equivalence of our leaders with dead Hamasniks was just an abomination. And we need to hear this from our spiritual leaders, from our moral leaders, because it's a moral and spiritual problem as well as a political and diplomatic problem.
In some respects, that's one of the no-abide laws, by the way, in terms of if one lives in a society where there are court systems and so on. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. One thing we haven't mentioned in the conversation so far, and we'll be concluding in just a few minutes. So let me just first of all remind everyone that we have a fourth annual Unbelievable Conference will be in Washington, D.C., May 4th through 6th. You won't want to miss it. We've got an all-star cast coming to speak and chances for rabbis to meet with each other. We'll also be spending an advocacy day on the Hill as well. But one of the things we haven't talked about is Iran. Do you obviously, I know that you're not a government official, and if you were, you wouldn't be able to answer this question anyway. But what about Iran in terms of, whether or not there's a sense that there's a desire, appetite, or maybe with the new Trump administration, the ability to go in and try and do what needs to be done there?
So yes, we're just talking tea leaves. Well, first, let's talk about the degree to which, despite Joe Biden telling us take the win, in two sorties, we discovered that and I say we, both as Americans and Israelis, had overestimated Iran's power. And I've been saying this for years, that Iran is a paper tiger, and Iran has much less ability than we've imputed to them. And we saw how easy it was to knock them down. And shame on the United States of America for letting Israel do its dirty work in Syria and in Iran. America should be taking the lead. That's number one. But I was just talking to a friend of mine from Boston, and he was saying, well, it's very clear that Bibi did the Gaza deal, but Trump has given him the green light to go crazy in Gaza and the territories. And I said, I don't know. The tea leaves that people are reading here are that Trump is focused on Gaza, so Bibi has to be a good boy, quote unquote, in Gaza. But the assumption is that somehow there was a promise that either America or Israel can do more work that needs to be done in Iran. And look, you have a teetering regime that has been playing very cleverly on American terms as much more of a player than it is. And the thing I most want from the Trump administration, not bombing, is to go back to the strategy which actually they had between 2017 and 2021 of using soft power to try to weaken the regime. And I heard this from an Iranian dissident who has ties in Washington and tied both to the Biden and Trump administrations. And she said that they felt that they got more support from the Trump administration in trying to push soft power to help the Iranian regime collapse from within. Look at them economically. Look at them in terms of oil. And by the way, I think that the United States of America should be thinking, and I'd be saying this, before Trump and after Trump, that maybe we need to start going after their infrastructure, because we also have to figure out how do we control the Houthis, because with each passing month, the cost to the international community of the disrupted shipping lanes grows. And the United States of America has to take the lead. And it's done some bombing sorties, most recently with England. And fascinating, there was one last one with England, Israel, and the United States coordinating. But we need to solve these problems. And I think they're solvable because I think these regimes are much weaker and much more cowardly and have much less, and especially the Iranian regime, has much less appetite for losing soldiers and losing civilians than certainly the Houthis.
Two last quick questions. Number one, Syria. Again, mixed signals coming out of there. They want to be with us, and yet they are allowing ISIS or Al Qaeda to be on the northern border of Israel with Syria, is what we've heard. What do you make of the new regime there?
So first of all, there too is very interesting that Netanyahu went in, did the world's dirty work by destroying the military infrastructure, by destroying the chemical weapons. Why didn't the United States take the lead? I'm happy to see that he seized some territory there too, not for imperialist terms, but for improving our defense. Anybody who predicts what's happening in the Middle East is delusional. So what are our worries? Our worries are Turkey. Turkey's making a massive move, putting pressure on the Kurds and coming in. ISIS and Qatar. One of the dark state type conspiracy theories that I heard was that Qatar was very happy to see us knock down Hezbollah in Lebanon, because their plan is, once Iran, even though they're occasionally friends, once Iran is humiliated in Lebanon, then Qatar is going to come in. I don't understand why we've indulged them for so long. We have a huge base there that is important to them, not just to us. We allow them to throw money around. Turkey is a member of NATO. I think we have to start thinking peripherally, with peripheral vision, looking peripherally and thinking more broadly about how we put pressure on these bad actors, because they are bad actors and they're destabilizing the country of Syria and the world. And we need a kind of leadership that really thinks in much less in military terms and much more in these kind of strategic soft power terms.
Fascinating. So the last question I want to ask you is where we started. We're talking about the deal and the fact that there are 34 hostages who are being released over a period of 42 days, during which time there's supposed to be a ceasefire, and that's supposed to be phase one. Do you think we get to phase two and/or phase three? We've heard a lot of skepticism about that.
What I most hear on the radio is the pain of parents whose kids are not in, or relatives are not in the first batch. And they are, and they use phrases. I hate the degree to which Israelis go to Nazi terminology, but they're using, so I'm quoting, not validating. They're using phrases like the selection. They're saying, why was there selection between some and not others? And I'm torn, because on the one hand, every human being saved is a human being saved, but this notion also of, even if you look at the first batch, I even hate the language we use. The first group of human beings, 3, and then 13. What is going on? I looked this up in the after 1973, the Egyptian prisoner exchange took all of a week. The Syrian prisoner exchange took all of 6 days. The Vietnam War prisoner exchange didn't schlep out over 6 weeks, and then who knows, the batch 2 and batch 3. So this is really problematic, and people feel that Bibi ultimately caved because of Trump pressure, but I don't know. I want to end on a more positive note. I want to go back to my tremendous gratitude for all of you, my love and my respect, and also empathy, because I know it's been very difficult. I know in many congregations there's a lot of pain. I know, and that's part of the reason why I'm giving you this gift of thinking through the April 1st Zionists who love you, who support you, who love us, who support us, but are really, really torn. And I don't think we've appreciated the impact that this has had. We're talking about the trauma that we've had, the trauma that American Jews have gone through, and the trauma that the American leadership and American rabbis have gone through. And so I'm really sending you hugs. I'm really sending you thanks. And but I'm also not stuck in trauma, and you're not stuck in trauma for one reason, because we have one another, because we have this unbelievable story. We have these tremendous values. We have heroic kids. Did you see how the kids at Columbia just put up with that intrusion in on the first day in the class? I was very active at McGill University for years as a Zionist. I never felt threatened. I never felt harassed. My students at Columbia, at McGill, and they're all our students, have endured things that are unbelievable, and they're not giving in, and we're not giving in, and that's our power.
Thank you.
We know who we are. I'm Yisrael Chai.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. It's a little bit past midnight in Israel, so it's been an amazing conversation. When I was in Israel since October 7th, the signs that say Yachad Ninatzeach, which everyone translates as "Together we will win." But Ninatzeach really means more than that. I always translate it as "Together we will prevail," and I think that's an important to keep in mind. Thank you very much, Gil. Thank you to all of us, all of you who have participated. That's what the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is about, and that is strengthening our ability to go forward, giving us the tools, the resources. So I hope all of you will be able, or many of you will join us in May in Washington, as well as participate in our other webinars and conversations that we have. Laila Tov to you and to everyone else as well. Thank you.
Thank you.